So imagine you open up like a massive 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right. And the box shows this classic American car,
Hmm.
and the label just proudly says, made in the USA.
Oh, yeah, a classic, right?
Exactly. But then when you actually start putting it together, you realize that the pieces, well, they were printed in Germany
Mm-hmm.
and cut in Mexico,
Mm.
shipped from Canada, and basically just glued together in Michigan.
Yeah, that sounds about right for modern manufacturing.
Right. And if you suddenly just slap a border tax on any individual piece of that puzzle, the price of the final picture just skyrockets.
It absolutely does.
So that puzzle is, it's pretty much a perfect metaphor for the modern American automotive industry.
Oh, 100%.
And right now, looking at early May 2026, there's this massive 25% tariff that's basically threatening to upend that entire box.
Yeah, it's getting really tense out there.
It is. So welcome to another deep dive. Today, we are digging into the objective data to figure out why, protecting a domestic car company could accidentally make a locally built vehicle over 6% more expensive.
Yeah, and that 6% increase, it exposes this just incredible economic paradox. Because once you look under the hood of how a global supply chain actually operates, you start to realize that taxing imports almost always guarantees a tax on your own domestic assembly line.
It's wild. So for this deep dive, we've grabbed a huge stack of really revealing sources to sort of map out this collision between trade policy and manufacturing reality.
What have we got today?
Well, we're looking at recent news dispatches tracking the unraveling of the 2025 Turnberry Agreement, plus an economic briefing straight from the European Parliament about their retaliation strategy, and a really detailed academic paper that analyzes conduct, scale economies, and trade models in the U.S. auto market.
That's a solid stack. But before we dig into the mechanisms of all these policies, I think we really need to set the parameters for this analysis.
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it.
Because the sources we're utilizing today, they contain some highly politically charged maneuvers from both the Trump administration and leaders within the European Union.
Right. Very heated right now.
Exactly. But we are completely bypassing the politics today. We're not here to endorse policies, condemn them, or, debate their ethics. Our sole focus is just reading the objective economic data.
Just the numbers.
Just the numbers. We want to understand the market mechanics and really dissect the real-world supply chain outcomes that are presented in this material.
Right, sticking strictly to the data and the financial fallout. So, to set the current scene for everyone, it is early May 2026.
Time flies.
It does. And the Turnberry Agreement, which, if you remember, was established back in August 2025 to cap global auto tariffs at 15%. Well, it's falling apart.
Yeah, falling apart is a good way to put it.
The U.S. administration has just announced an increase in tariffs on EU cars and trucks to 25%. And they're citing that the European bloc basically isn't fully complying with the framework of that original deal.
Right. And to understand the mechanism driving this sudden jump to 25%, we have to look back at a massive legal pivot that happened just a few months ago.
Right, back in February.
Exactly. In February 2026, the U.S. Supreme Court fundamentally altered the administration's tariff toolkit.
Big time.
Yeah, they struck down a sweeping set of global tariffs that had been implemented under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the IEEPA.
Right, the IETA, which historically that's used for genuine national security emergencies, right?
Yes, exactly.
Like, freezing the assets of hostile nations or terrorist organizations.
Yeah.
So using it to levy broad tariffs on allied trading partners over economic imbalances, that was a massive legal stretch.
Huge stretch, which really explains why the Supreme Court ultimately invalidated that approach.
Yeah, the court ruled the president basically lacked the statutory authority to declare a generalized economic emergency just to bypass traditional trade law.
Precisely. So to maintain these levies on the auto sector, the administration had to pivot. They pivoted to two distinct legal mechanisms.
Okay, what are they?
The first is Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, which explicitly deals with imports that threaten to impair national security. And the second is Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, which permits temporary tariffs to address severe balance of payments deficits.
Okay, I want to focus on Section 232 for a second. Because, honestly, the idea of a German luxury sedan being a national security threat sounds completely baffling on the surface.
I mean, yeah, it does sound a bit strange at first.
Right, but the underlying argument there relies on the concept of the defense industrial base. The administration's argument is that if the domestic auto industry is, hollowed out by foreign competition, The U.S. loses that raw manufacturing capacity.
And the heavy machinery.
Exactly. The machinery and the skilled labor pool required to build tanks, aircraft, and munitions if a global conflict breaks out.
Right, so the administration is basically treating commercial automotive capacity as a direct proxy for military readiness.
Okay, that makes sense. Meanwhile, the European Union is not just quietly accepting this 25% hike.
Oh, definitely not.
They have activated a 26 billion euro countermeasures toolkit. And the strategy behind their retaliation is just fascinating from a game theory perspective.
It really is.
Because their target list is basically a masterclass in asymmetrical retaliation. I mean, we are talking about a multi-billion-dollar dispute over heady industry, right? Steel, aluminum, cars.
Heavy stuff.
Yet the EU is explicitly aiming their tariffs at goods like bourbon whiskey, denim jeans, and Harley-Davidson motorcycles.
Right. Which seems weird until you look at the map.
Exactly. Why target those when we're talking about massive auto disputes?
Yeah.
It's because they are intentionally ignoring the scale of the industries and focusing entirely on the geography of the production.
Yeah, they are localizing the economic pain to exert maximum political leverage. It's incredibly strategic.
Right.
By targeting bourbon, you hit the economy of Kentucky. By targeting motorcycles, you hit Wisconsin. The European Parliament's strategy is basically to cause highly concentrated economic disruption right in the home states and congressional districts of the specific U.S. politicians who champion these tariffs in the first place.
That is ruthless.
It is. The goal isn't necessarily to damage the broad U.S. economy. The goal is to force domestic business owners and local labor unions to pressure their own representatives to return to the negotiating table.
But, while the EU's retaliation is super targeted, the collateral damage on their own soil is vast.
Oh, it's immense.
The Kiel Institute for the World Economy ran the macroeconomic projections on this tariff war, and they estimate the U.S. tariffs could cost the German economy roughly $18 billion in total output.
$18 billion. And, Germany is uniquely exposed here.
How so?
Well, they're an export-driven economy, and right now they're facing sluggish domestic growth. I think it's projected at just 0.8% this year.
Oh, wow. That's really low.
Yeah. So when your entire economic engine relies on selling manufactured goods abroad, a 25% barrier at your largest trading partner's border, that is a devastating blow to your national output.
So if we dumb in from that macro level down to the specific companies in the crosshairs, German automakers like Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes, they are facing an absolute logistical nightmare.
Oh, it's a mess.
Germany exported around 450,000 vehicles to the United States in 2024 alone. But the reality of how these companies operate creates this massive split reality. And BMW is like the perfect case study to illustrate this.
Yeah, BMW is fascinating because they essentially operate in two completely different tariff environments simultaneously.
Right. So take the brand new BMW iX3. It's this highly anticipated electric crossover, base price of around $60,000.
Beautiful car.
Yeah. But BMW chose to build it in Debrecen, Hungary, which is an EU member state.
Right.
So because it's assembled in Europe, that $60,000 vehicle gets hit with the full 25% tariff the literal moment it reaches a U.S. port.
Right.
Which drastically alters its competitiveness against an American-made EV.
Exactly. But then, literally on the very same dealer lot in the U.S., you will find the BMW X5, the X6, and the X7.
Right.
And those models completely bypass the EU tariff. Why? Because they're assembled at BMW's massive plant in Spartanburg, South Carolina.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. Spartanburg is actually the largest European-owned vehicle manufacturing facility in the United States.
So this European brand has a massive domestic footprint. But the American brands are incredibly vulnerable too. The big three, Ford, General Motors, Stellantis, they've been aggressively lobbying the administration for exemptions.
Yes, specifically asking to insulate the USMCA, the trade agreement linking the U.S., Mexico, and Canada.
Right. And here's where it gets really interesting, because their lobbying efforts expose a huge flaw in how the general public perceives a quote-unquote domestic vehicle.
Oh, absolutely, the assembly illusion.
Yeah. People assume that if they buy a Ford truck and the window sticker says it was assembled at a plant in Michigan, they assume they're buying a product that is 100% American and completely insulated from a global trade war.
But the reality of global value chains completely shatters that assumption.
Break it down for us. Why are the big three so nervous?
Well, a modern vehicle is an incredibly complex assembly of around 30,000 individual parts. And on average, a vehicle assembled in the United States contains 50% foreign-sourced components by value.
Wait, 50%?
50%. Half of the car crossed an international border before it ever reached that assembly line in Michigan.
That integration is just astonishing. So you could have, like, copper mined in South America,
Yep.
shipped to Asia to be drawn into wire, sent to Mexico to be braided into a massive electrical harness, and then finally shipped up to Detroit to be dropped into a chassis.
Exactly. The industry has spent 4 decades optimizing this network to shave pennies off the cost of every single component. Factories across the US, Canada, and Mexico, they basically operate almost as a single, borderless manufacturing floor.
Right. Parts routinely cross the border multiple times during fabrication.
Exactly. So when automakers lobby for domestic protection, they run the very real risk of accidentally lobbying for a tax on their own sprawling supply chains.
Wow.
You just cannot place a wall around the final assembly plant without starving it of the components it needs to run.
Man. And this actually brings us to the core of the academic paper in our source stack.
Yes, the 2018 data.
Right. Researchers took this highly detailed real-world data from the 2018 auto market to basically simulate these exact 2026 tariff scenarios.
And the results are wild.
They really wanted to see what actually happens to consumer prices and market share when you pull these protectionist levers. They modeled two distinct approaches. The first is what they call a car-only tariff.
Right. So under a car-only tariff, the U.S. imposes the 25% levy exclusively on finished imported vehicles.
Okay.
The parts and components flowing across the border remain untaxed.
Got it. And the outcome for imported cars in this scenario is largely what you'd expect. The price of foreign cars jumps by 24.2%.
Which is a near 100% pass-through.
Exactly. The automakers can't just absorb a 25% tax, so they pass almost the entire cost directly onto the consumer. If you want the imported sedan, you pay the premium.
But the data reveals something much more complex regarding the domestic cars. The simulation shows the price of a U.S.-assembled vehicle doesn't stay flat. It actually decreases by 0.85%.
Okay, wait. I want to really dig into the mechanics of that price drop because on the surface, that seems totally counterintuitive.
I know, it does.
If your competitor is suddenly forced to raise their prices by 24%, the natural capitalist instinct would be to raise your own prices slightly, right? To increase your profit margin while still undercutting them. So why on earth would domestic automakers actively lower their retail prices?
Right, so the answer lies in two intersecting economic principles: Corno competition and economies of scale.
Okay, Corona competition, what is that?
So Corno competition is an economic model describing a market where companies compete by setting their production quantities rather than setting their prices directly.
Okay, so the automotive industry is forced into this Corno model because of just the sheer physical reality of building cars. Like, you can't just pivot a factory on a dime to double production over the weekend.
Exactly. Automakers have to commit to massive production quotas, say 100,000 units of a specific truck months in advance.
Right.
Because they need to secure the steel, the microchips, the factory time. So the total volume of vehicles they essentially dump into the market ultimately dictates the clearing price.
Ah, I see. So when foreign cars suddenly become 24% more expensive due to the tariff, a massive segment of consumers shifts their demand toward the cheaper domestic options.
You got it. And domestic automakers anticipate this surge in market share, so they aggressively ramp up their production quotas. And this is where economies of scale take over.
Right. We hear economies of scale a lot, but it is incredibly pronounced in heavy manufacturing. Like, think about the upfront capital required to tool a factory. If an automaker needs to die cast an aluminum engine block, the massive industrial machinery and the molds required to do that might cost tens of millions of dollars.
Oh, absolutely.
The very first engine block that comes off that line is astronomically expensive. But the 100,000th engine block costs a fraction of a cent in machinery wear and tear.
Exactly. Spreading those massive fixed costs over a much larger number of vehicles drastically reduces the per-unit manufacturing cost.
Right.
Because the domestic automakers are building significantly more cars to capture that new demand, it actually becomes cheaper to build each individual car.
Oh, my.
So they take a portion of those manufacturing savings and pass it on to the consumer as a 0.85% retail price cut.
Which makes their vehicles even more attractive and just accelerates their capture of the market.
Exactly. Under a strictly car-only tariff, domestic manufacturers leverage scale to achieve a massive competitive victory.
Okay, but the researchers ran a second simulation. And this is the big twist. This is where the paradox is fully realized. Scenario 2 models the impact of stacked tariffs. This is a situation where the administration taxes the finished imported vehicles and simultaneously taxes the foreign parts and components being imported to build the domestic cars.
And that changes everything. Because that 50% foreign parts average we discussed earlier suddenly becomes a massive liability.
Right.
The cost of manufacturing a car inside the United States just skyrockets because the domestic automaker is paying a 25% premium on half of the physical materials required to build the vehicle.
I was looking at the price modeling for scenario 2, and then the math just violently flips. That 0.85% price drop we saw in the first scenario completely vanishes.
It's gone.
And it is replaced by a 6.5% price increase on the domestic car.
Yeah. The very policy explicitly designed to shield domestic manufacturers and benefit local consumers ends up heavily taxing both of them.
I mean, a 6.5% increase on a $50,000 truck built in Michigan is over $3,000 added to the sticker price, purely because the underlying supply chain is too integrated to isolate.
It proves that in a modern, globalized manufacturing environment, you cannot punish the import without simultaneously punishing the domestic assembly that relies on it.
Exactly. So we've covered the sticker shock for the consumer, but I really want to pan out and look at the broader macroeconomic damage, because the researchers calculated the total surplus losses.
Right, which essentially measures the overall economic harm to consumers and firms, even after you factor in the billions of dollars in tax revenue the government actually collects from these tariffs.
Right. So what's the bottom line? How much does this cost the economy?
The economic drain is severe. Under the car-only tariff scenario, the total welfare loss to the U.S. economy is approximately $18 billion.
And it's really vital to point out that this $18 billion U.S. welfare loss is a completely separate metric from the $18 billion hit to the German economy we discussed earlier.
Correct. Both sides are suffering massive, independent economic hemorrhages. And when the simulation shifts to the stacked tariff scenario where the parts are taxed alongside the finished cars, that U.S. welfare loss nearly doubles to $31.6 billion.
That's insane.
Yeah, taxing the supply chain severely amplifies the overall drag on the economy.
Okay, I want to play devil's advocate here for a second and push back on the focus on welfare loss. Because the core political and social argument for implementing these tariffs is domestic job creation.
True.
Proponents argue that making imports artificially expensive basically forces multinational companies to physically relocate their factories onto U.S. soil, thereby bringing manufacturing jobs back to local communities. So does the economic modeling actually support that narrative?
Well, objectively, yes. The tariffs do compel domestic expansion. The models indicate that under the car-owned scenario, the United States would generate roughly 68,000 new jobs in automotive assembly.
Okay.
Because as domestic production volume ramps up to replace those imported vehicles, automakers naturally have to hire more workers to staff the assembly lines.
Right, and adding 68,000 manufacturing jobs sounds like a massive victory on paper. I mean, that's 68,000 families getting steady paychecks.
It is.
But as financial analysts, we have to evaluate the efficiency of that job creation, right? We have to look at the cost per job. So what does this all mean? Is the job creation actually worth the consumer price hikes?
That's the critical question. When you divide the total economic welfare loss by the number of jobs created, the trade-off becomes highly inefficient.
What are the numbers?
According to the simulations, the broad economic damage inflicted on consumers to create a single assembly job ranges from $168,000 to $876,000 annually.
Wait, what? We really need to linger on that math for a moment. Society is absorbing up to $876,000 in broad economic damage through higher prices, reduced consumption, market inefficiencies, just to subsidize one single auto worker job.
That's what the data shows.
Considering the average auto worker makes around $75,000 a year, the macroeconomic premium we are paying to force that job into existence is just staggering.
It really is.
Yeah.
And the situation deteriorates even further for the labor market when we look at the stacked tariff scenario.
How could it get worse?
Well, one might assume that taxing foreign parts would trigger a boom in domestic parts manufacturing to replace them, right?
Yeah, that would be the logical assumption.
But instead, the model shows the job gains in the domestic parts sector actually plummet.
Wait, really? If we place a 25% tax on foreign microchips and wiring harnesses, doesn't that inherently force the creation of U.S. parts factories? Why would the job gains plummet when the domestic parts manufacturers finally have protection from foreign competition?
It comes right back to that 6.5% price increase on the domestic cars.
Oh.
Yeah. When stacked tariffs force the sticker price of a domestic vehicle up by thousands of dollars, consumer demand naturally crashes.
Of course. People delay buying a new car, or they just buy a used one instead.
Exactly. Because total domestic auto sales slow down, the final assembly plants reduce their output. They are building fewer cars, which means they need fewer parts overall, foreign or domestic.
So you implement a policies specifically to protect local parts manufacturers, and you end up basically bankrupting them because you accidentally crash the consumer demand for the final product.
It perfectly illustrates the extreme sensitivity of global value chains. You pull a macroeconomic lever expecting a linear result, and it triggers this cascading reaction across the supply chain that achieves the exact opposite of your intention. You just shrink the entire ecosystem.
Man, it brings us right back to the jigsaw puzzle from the beginning. You cannot fundamentally alter the shape and cost of the individual pieces and expect the final picture to just fit together seamlessly.
You really can't. The overarching analytical takeaway from these sources is that isolationist trade policies are mathematically treacherous to execute in an interwoven global economy.
Absolutely.
The supply chain integration is so deep that attempting to surgical strike foreign competitors almost always results in friendly fire on your own domestic consumers and workforce.
Right. Modern manufacturing is just not a simple story of us versus them. Cars are complex global puzzles, and taxing the pieces of the puzzle inherently raises the price of the finished picture, regardless of whose soil the factory sits on.
Well said.
Which leaves us with one final, highly provocative thought from the research for you to mull over. We have spent this entire deep dive analyzing how American-assembled cars rely heavily on foreign parts. But the pipeline flows in both directions.
It does.
Foreign-assembled vehicles rely heavily on American-made components, too. On average, an imported car contains about 9% U.S.-made parts by value. But for vehicles assembled in Mexico and imported into the U.S., the American-made component share can jump up to 38%.
Which means a massive portion of the quote-unquote foreign car is actually American labor.
Exactly. So if reciprocal tariffs trigger an escalating global trade war targeting individual components, the fundamental nature of automotive engineering might change. Will the automakers of the near future be forced to spend more time, money, and talent engineering their supply chains to creatively evade international taxes than they spend engineering the actual performance, safety, and efficiency of the cars you drive? If half the pieces in your manufacturing puzzle are suddenly too expensive to touch, do you spend billions redesigning the entire puzzle from scratch? Or do you simply pass that massive inefficiency straight onto the person buying the box? Something to carefully consider the next time you look closely at the fine print on a window sticker.